In Misty Harbor, reality has always been a little fractured. The sky here is the color of dirty lead, and the shadows so thick you feel like you could drown in them. I worked as a port watchman for 40 years and thought I'd seen it all: betrayal, blood, and fear. But what I saw that November evening at Pier 12 made me question my own sanity. Imagine the most brutal butcher on the coast, a man whose very name made smugglers' knees buckle, standing waist-deep in icy, black water. He didn't torture his enemy or bury his tracks. He was repairing an old, rotten boat, repairing it for a small, hunched old woman who looked at him with her one eye as if she possessed his soul. Her name was Marta, and in this cursed city, she was feared more than death. They whispered about her in the dark corners of taverns, calling her the saint, but there was no light in that word, only a primal terror. It was said that anyone who looked in her direction with ill intent would vanish forever into the fog. I decided to learn her secret, and this truth proved more terrifying than any bullet. She was the keeper of the keys to the cabinets where the skeletons of our city's entire elite hid. In her hands was a book capable of burning this world to the ground. My name is Viktor Gromov, and this is the story of how one forgotten act of mercy created the most terrible monster, and why sometimes silence is the only way to remain human in hell. Misty Harbor lived up to its name that day with a peculiar, vengeful zeal. Thick as sour milk, steam rose from the sea abyss, enveloping rusty cranes, the skeletons of unfinished ships, and grey concrete piers. A heavy mist of salt, fuel oil, and rotting seaweed hung in the air. In this city, the 1990s felt more than just a decade, but a lingering illness that transformed everything around them into the setting for a nightmarish cartoon. Viktor Gromov, a port control inspector, walked along Pier 12. His figure, in a long canvas raincoat with its collar raised, resembled a dark, angular silhouette cut out of black paper. His face, furrowed like an old map, was frozen in a grimace of perpetual discontent. Gromov was accustomed to the port being the territory of predators. There were no laws of the state here, only the laws of fangs and scales. And the chief predator in this aquarium was Arthur, whom everyone called Scar both behind his back and to his face. Gromov remembered Scar as the embodiment of primal menace. He stood almost 2 meters tall, with shoulders that barely fit through doorways, and a face marred by a deep white scar from temple to chin. This scar gave him a perpetually bared, ferocious expression, as if he were ready to tear anyone's throat out at any second. Scar terrified not only the smugglers but also the port's top management. They feared him more than death, because death was swift, while Scar's wrath was inventive and long-lasting. That's why what Gromov saw at the far pier made him stop so abruptly that the soles of his boots squeaked on the icy concrete. There, waist-deep in the icy November water, black and sticky as tar, stood Scar, the most dangerous man on the coast. His bare torso, covered in tattoos that in this light looked like writhing snakes, was deathly pale, almost blue from the cold. Arthur's teeth chattered loudly, audible even over the roar of the surf, and a thin trickle of blood trickled from his nose. His blood vessels couldn't withstand the temperature change. But he paid no attention. In his hands, he held a heavy hammer and planks that smelled of fresh resin. Arthur was repairing an old, half-rotted boat that was barely afloat. This boat belonged to Marta. Old Marta sat on the pier directly above him. She resembled an ancient bird, swathed in shapeless rags the color of wet ash. Her figure was hunched over, almost broken at right angles, giving her the appearance of a grotesque doll from a horror film. Her face, hidden in the shadow of a deep hood, was a maze of deep furrows, and her single good eye glowed with a cold, supernatural fire. The other was covered by a whitish, cloudy veil. A crowd had gathered around the pier. Longshoremen, sailors, petty thieves, about 30 of them, stood frozen in deathly silence. Their eyes betrayed not just shock, but superstitious horror. It was a sight that shattered reality, a beast willingly accepting the yoke of slavery. Scar hammered nail after nail, and each blow of the hammer echoed in the silence of the port like a gunshot. His fingers, accustomed to clutching the hilt of a knife or the throat of an enemy, were now clumsily and carefully mending the holy bottom. Gromov, driven by his professional habit of restoring order or simply by the stupefaction of what he saw, took a step forward. "What's going on here?" His voice sounded hoarse and cracked. "Scar, are you crazy? Get out of the water. You'll die of frostbite in 10 minutes. And what's this masquerade with the boat?" Arthur didn't even look up. He only gripped his hammer tighter, his knuckles whitening. The muscles in his back rolled under his skin like boulders in a sack. He seemed oblivious to the inspector, completely immersed in his own atoning work. Gromov walked to the very edge of the pier and extended his hand, intending to grab Arthur by the shoulder and pull him out of this icy mess. Who am I talking to? This is a violation of all regulations. At that moment, Marta stirred. Her movement was sharp, bird-like. She raised her head, and Gromov met her one living eye. There was no malice in that gaze. It was filled with such a bottomless, icy depth that it took the inspector's breath away. It seemed to him that the contours of the world around him suddenly became sharper, rougher, as if someone had outlined everything around him with thick, black charcoal. Martha's face looked like a mask in this light, an exaggeratedly sharp nose, a sunken mouth, and that eye that seemed to see not Gromov's clothes, but his very soul. "Leave him alone, Warden," she rasped. Her voice resembled the sound of a rusty saw biting into frozen wood. "He's paying a debt you can't even imagine." Gromov froze. The chill emanating from Marta was stronger than the cold of the water Scar stood in. He felt goosebumps run down his spine, turning into prickly needles of ice. "What debt?" Viktor whispered, not knowing why he was asking. "He's a bandit, a murderer." Marta slowly extended her dry, bony hand toward him. Her fingers were long and thin, like a vulture's claws. She didn't touch him, but Gromov recoiled as if struck by an electric shock. "Guard your secrets, son," she said, each word falling into the silence like a heavy stone. "You all have skeletons in your closet that rattle at night, but yours are especially noisy. Keep them hidden, don't give them a chance to escape. Otherwise, one day they'll get hungry and eat you alive." Her lips stretched into a semblance of a smile, revealing sparse, sharp teeth. It was a face from a nightmare after a long shift at the port. At that moment, Scar hammered the last board in with a resounding splash and, breathing heavily, looked at Marta. In his gaze, in that gaze of the cruelest man on the coast, Gromov saw something he never expected to find in Arthur. There was an endless, slavish, devoted fear, and an equally endless gratitude. Scar stood in the water, battered by the cold, humiliated before the crowd of his subordinates, but he looked as if he had just rescued his soul from hell itself. Gromov backed away. He walked back without turning around, feeling Martha's single eye on him, until the fog once again swallowed their figures. For a long time, he heard the measured blows of the hammer from the fog. Scar continued to strengthen the boat, as if the sun would rise over Misty Harbor tomorrow depended on every nail driven. The inspector walked to his desk, and for the first time in 40 years of service at the port, he felt truly afraid. Not for his life, but for the truth he had come to regard as immutable. Misty Harbor was clearly ruled by a force not mentioned in forensic science textbooks, and this force had the face of the ancient crone from a lighthouse. Misty Haven was a place where reality twisted and knotted like old ship's rope. The sky here was always the color of dirty lead, and the shadows seemed thicker and heavier than the objects themselves. If someone were to sketch the city, they would need only the blackest ink and the sharpest china. The lines of the buildings were jagged, the contours bold and harsh, and the people's faces resembled grotesque masks from horror comics, where every wrinkle was drawn with terrifying precision. Viktor Gromov, still stunned by the encounter at the dock, sat in the darkest corner of the Drowned Man Tavern. This establishment was the heart of the harbor's criminal underworld. The walls were blackened with oil and tobacco smoke, and a heavy, exaggerated darkness hung from a ceiling. The tin-shaded lamp swayed, casting sharp, flickering shadows that transformed ordinary dock thieves into deformed hunchbacks with long, grasping fingers. In the center of the room, beneath the only bright cone of light, sat Old Hook, a man whose face was a veritable textbook on the anatomy of horror. His lower jaw was unnaturally displaced, and his eyes, surrounded by deep black circles, were perpetually watery. He was a living encyclopedia of the port, and it was to him that Gromov turned for answers. "You saw that, yes, Inspector." Hook croaked, his voice like the crunch of bones under a boot. "Did you see how Scar bowed to the old woman? Now you understand why silence is worth more than gold in our city." Hook leaned closer, and in the lamplight his face became a cluster of sharp angles and deep hollows. He began to talk about the beacon of silence and its inhabitant. In the criminal circles of Misty Haven, Martha was called the Saint. But the word held no divine light. It held a primal, paralyzing dread of something beyond human comprehension. There was an unwritten law, seared into the mind of everyone who carried a knife in their pocket. Martha is the void. Don't look into it, don't think about it, and for heaven's sake, never cross its threshold. "They say," Hook whispered, and those around the tables fell silent, their faces drawn into exaggerated grimaces of attention, that anyone who looks at the lighthouse with greed or malice is already dead. Their body just doesn't know it yet. The fog takes such people. They don't simply vanish, they dissolve, becoming part of the white haze licking the stones at the foot of the lighthouse. Gromov listened, and it seemed to him that the walls of the tavern were narrowing, turning into a frame from a dark cartoon. Hook told a story that had become legend 3 years ago. Then the Piranha Gang came to town, visiting thugs who didn't believe in the local fairy tales. Their leader, a man with slit eyes and a perpetual snarl, decided that the old woman in the lighthouse was hiding contraband gold or jewels from the old regime. There were 5 of them, huge men, armed to the teeth, their hearts black as tar. They laughed at the warnings, and their laughter sounded in the fog like the tinkling of broken glass. They set out on a moonless night. Hook paused, his single eye widening to an incredible size, turning into a white ring. We heard only fog. Not a single shot, not a single scream. Only silence, so thick it was deafening. The next morning, the haven shook. At the foot of the Rock of Sighs, right under the lighthouse, the surf spat out their boats. The sight of these vessels was the first thing that sent a shudder through the air. They weren't just wrecked, they were literally chewed up by the rocks, reduced to splinters, even though the sea that night was as calm as a mirror. There was no trace of gunpowder or blood on the wreckage. Only seaweed, reminiscent of the long, tangled hair of the dead. But the worst was waiting on the shore. The 4 piranhas sat on the sand, their backs pressed against each other. Their postures were unnaturally crooked, their fingers clutching the sand convulsively. When the dockworkers came closer, they saw faces that would haunt them in nightmares for the rest of their lives. The bandits' faces were distorted into exaggerated masks of horror, their mouths gaped so wide that the skin on their cheeks had split, their eyes bulging, frozen in a silent scream. But most importantly, they were absolutely snow white. Their hair, eyebrows, and even their stubble had turned grey overnight. It wasn't just old age, it was the colour of bleached bone. They couldn't speak, Hook continued, his hand shaking, spilling cheap booze. They only moaned and pointed their fingers at the lighthouse. The 5th, their leader, was nowhere to be found. It was as if the fog had swallowed him whole, leaving not even a button behind. Those who survived went mad that same day. Their eyes remained empty, forever imbued with the same white haze that surrounds the lighthouse. They sat in the asylum, constantly covering their faces with their hands, as if trying to block out what they had seen that night in Martha's chambers. Gromov felt cold sweat trickle down his back, tracing every line of his spine under his cloak. He remembered the gaze of Martha's single eye, that piercing, icy beam that seemed to pierce him through and through. Why weren't they shot? Why wasn't there a fight? Gromov forced out. Hook smiled bitterly, his face forming a strange pattern of shadows and folds. Because lead doesn't take a void, Inspector. There are things in this port that are older than the law and stronger than bullets. Martha doesn't just live there. She guards what must be hidden. And those who try to pierce the veil are met with a truth their minds can't bear. She doesn't kill them herself. What kills them is what they see in her mirrors. At that moment, the tavern door swung open, and a wisp of fog rushed in, like the tentacle of a huge monster. Everyone shuddered. One of Scar's men stood in the doorway, pale, his eye twitching. He said nothing, simply nodded to Hook, who instantly fell silent, turning into a motionless statue. Gromov realized the secret of the Beacon of Silence was more than just an urban legend. This is the foundation on which the fragile world of the Haven rests. Marta was a lightning rod for all the evil that festered in these alleys. She was a saint not out of mercy, but out of the possession of a secret capable of scorching the soul of anyone who proved insufficiently strong. Leaving the tavern, Gromov glanced toward the lighthouse. There, in the distance, through the thick cotton wool of fog, a weak, uneven light flickered. It seemed small and defenseless, but now Viktor knew, this light was a warning. A thick black outline separating the world of the living from what lurked in the white void. He remembered Marta's words, "Guard your secrets, son." In this city, everyone harbored their own fog, and for the first time, Gromov felt his own secrets stirring in the depths of his consciousness, threatening to one day emerge and turn his hair the same deathly white he'd seen on the faces of those who dared to disturb the lighthouse's silence. Now he knew, the next part of his investigation would lead him to the origins of this power, to a time before the lighthouse was silent, and Marta wasn't a saint. But to do that, he needed to look into the past, where the shadows were even longer and the faces even more terrifying. The interior of the Beacon of Silence resembled the insides of a gigantic, diseased beast. A spiral staircase, eaten away by rust, ascended, curving at unnatural, sharp angles, like the spine of a monster. The walls were covered in layers of old paint, peeling and hanging in flaps like dead skin. Viktor Gromov climbed slowly, each step echoing with a hollow, tinny groan, carried upward to the lantern itself. The air here was different, thick, still, saturated with the scent of ozone, old paper, and something sweetly smoldering. When Gromov finally reached the upper living room, he paused in the threshold. The room was round and cramped, cluttered with objects that looked like the set of a forgotten horror film. Stacks of yellowed newspapers, tied with black ribbons, towered everywhere. Jars of murky liquid stood on the shelves, and bunches of keys hung on the walls. Hundreds, thousands of keys of every size and shape. They swayed gently from the vibrations of the sea, emitting a thin, barely audible chime, like the whisper of hundreds of ghosts. Marta sat in the center of this chaos, in a deep Voltaire-style armchair. The light from the kerosene lamp fell on her face from below, turning it into a grotesque mask. The shadows in her eye sockets became pitch-black hollows, and her nose cast a long, sharp shadow across her forehead, bisecting her face. "Have you come for the truth, Inspector?" Her voice was drier than the crackling of twigs in a fire. Truth in this city isn't something that brings peace. It's something that makes you wake up in a cold sweat for the rest of your days. She reached a bony hand toward a massive chest bound in tarnished silver and pulled out an object wrapped in heavy velvet. When the cloth fell, Gromov saw a book. It was enormous, bound in rough, dark leather that in places seemed suspiciously like human leather. There was no title on the cover, only a deeply embossed image of a lock without a keyhole. "My father," Marta began, her single eye glittering like a drop of mercury, "was not a sailor. He was the master of the keys at the Iron Moor, that same fortress prison on the cliffs that was torn down before you were born. But the stones remember, and the paper remembers." Gromov involuntarily took a step back. The Iron Moor was a legend, a place from which no one returned. There, in dank casemates below sea level, they broke those who couldn't be officially broken. "He was the chief jailer of the old regime," Marta continued, her face distorting in the lamplight, becoming more intense, almost caricature-like in its grief. "Hundreds passed through his hands. Heroes who spat in the faces of their executioners. Traitors who sold their mothers for a breath of fresh air. And those they simply wanted to erase from history, turn into dust. Father didn't simply lock them away. He listened. He was their last witness." She slowly opened the book. The pages were covered in a small, sharp handwriting, reminiscent of barbed wire. Gromov saw columns of names, dates, and brief notes. "This is the Book of Visitors," the old woman whispered. "But in reality, it's the list of Judas. Everything is written here. Which of today's pillars of society wrote denunciations of their brothers to save their own skins? Which of your honest judges licked the boots of jailers in '57? Which of the current owners of the Harbor Corporation started out by robbing the corpses of their fellow inmates?" Marta pointed to one of the entries. Gromov spotted a familiar name, the name of the current mayor of the city. Next to it was a date and a note. "Sinned out 3. Cried. Asked for more bread. Fulfilled. See this, son." Marta lifted the book, and at that moment her face became truly terrifying. Her mouth stretched into an unnatural, wide grin. Her eyes, even the dull second eye seemed to come alive, glowed with triumph and endless weariness. "This city is built on bones and lies. Those who today wear silk ties and talk about morality once crawled at my father's feet, choking on their own snot." She slammed the book shut, and the sound was like the blow of an axe. "Before he died, my father gave it to me. He said, 'Martha, this is not just paper. These are leashes. As long as you keep these names, they are your slaves. But remember, if you reveal them, the city will drown in blood. The wrath of those betrayed will be more terrible than any storm.'" Now Gromov understood everything. He understood why Arthur Scar, whose father was probably also rotting in those cellars, stood in the icy water. He understood why bandits turned into grey-haired old men after one night in the lighthouse. They didn't see ghosts. They saw the truth about themselves and their ancestors. They saw a mirror in which their lineage was transformed into a chain of betrayals. Marta wasn't just an old woman. She was living compromat, the embodied conscience of the city, who chose the path of silent observation. She was the keeper of the keys to all the skeletons in Misty Harbor. "The city's elite knows I'm here," Marta said, turning back into a hunched bird. "They send me gifts. They guard this lighthouse better than a bank. They fear me more than the devil, because they know that if I die wrong, this book will fall into the hands of those who seek revenge, and then the city will burn." She looked at Viktor, and her gaze became almost sympathetic. "Now you also bear this key, Gromov. You know who really rules this port. Do you think your nerves can withstand this burden? Or would you prefer the fog to take you too?" Gromov was silent. His face, usually stern and motionless, was now distorted with doubt. The lines of his figure became jagged, uncertain. He felt the weight of this information pressing on his shoulders, bending him the way the years had bent Martha. In this cramped space, amid the jingling keys and the smell of decay, he realized his life had been divided into before and after. He was a supervisory inspector. He was looking for contraband, fuel oil, and stolen grain. But today he had found contraband of the soul, something impossible to seize or destroy. "Why did you tell me this?" he forced out. Marta closed her eyes again. "Because I need a successor, Viktor. Someone who understands that silence is not cowardice. It is the highest form of mercy in a world unworthy of the truth." Gromov turned and wandered toward the exit. As he descended the rusty stairs, he heard the thin, crystal chime of keys ringing above him again. Now he knew it wasn't just metal. These were the voices of hundreds of people whose destinies were locked in the leather-bound book of visitors, and Marta was the only one preventing them from breaking free and destroying Misty Harbor completely. Outside, the fog had grown even thicker, and the lighthouse now seemed not a saving landmark but a huge, ominous finger pressed to the lips of the universe. "Shush," whispered the sea. "Shush," echoed the wind. Gromov adjusted the collar of his cloak and vanished into the white mist, carrying with him the first of many keys he would collect. The events Martha recounted next transported Gromov to the time when Misty Harbor was on the verge of being transformed into a vast mass crypt. It was the era of the Great Storm, a natural disaster that coincided with an outbreak of port fever, a black plague that arrived in the holds of foreign cargo ships. In Gromov's mind, those years were depicted in the style of a grim, grimy graphic novel. The sky above the city was not simply grey, but inky black, streaked with zigzags of lightning, which in this distorted world looked like cracks in the shattered glass of reality. Rain poured for weeks, turning the streets into rivers of oil and sewage, and the wind howled through the harbour cranes like a pack of wounded dogs. That year, death was the cheapest commodity in the harbour, Martha began, her voice deepening, taking on the icy notes of the surf. Quarantine Barrack No. 7 stood right at the water's edge. It was a long, squat building, like a rotten tooth in the jaw of the coast. The windows were boarded up crosswise, and a dim, sickly yellow light constantly seeped through the cracks. Martha was very different then. In her story, she was a young woman with a determined face and hands that perpetually smelled of bleach and alcohol. She worked in that hell as a nurse. There was no medicine in the barracks, no hope, only the groans of people transformed by fever into living skeletons with sunken eyes and blackened lips. Port guards, those very dogs of the regime, stood in a cordon, their faces wrapped in rags, shooting at anyone who tried to cross the quarantine line. Amidst this chaos, I found him. Martha closed her one eye, immersing herself in the vision. A young man, almost a boy, with a shock of tangled hair and the gaze of a hunted wolf. It was Arthur. He wasn't yet a scar then. His face was clear, but the fire of rebellion was already raging within him. He was one of those who had led a rebellion at the docks against the inhumane conditions, and they had thrown him into Barrack 7 not for treatment, but to die. Arthur lay in the far corner, on the wet straw. The fever was burning him from the inside. His skin had taken on a sallow hue, and his breathing was ragged, like the wheezing of broken bellows. He had no chance. In the barracks, medication was only given to the useful, those who could still work or collaborated with the administration. Rebels were given only cold water and oblivion. Gromov listened, and in his mind's eye, images flashed past one another with terrifying clarity. Marta, creeping down the dark corridor of the administrative building. Her figure's lines were jagged, tense. She knew that if she were caught, the next body in the common pit would be her own. The head of security had a safe, Marta whispered. It contained vials of gold reserve, the only antibiotic that actually worked. I knew that for one such vial you could buy half the city, but I saw Arthur's eyes. They held not a thirst for life, but a thirst for justice. And I decided that this fire must never go out. She stole the medicine. It was an act of pure, insane mercy, devoid of logic. She gave Arthur a dose intended for a high-ranking officer. But that wasn't enough. The guards began searching, looking for the missing item, and barrack number 7 was first on the list. I carried him out on my back, the old woman continued. In the midst of the storm, when the waves lapped the pier, turning it into the slippery maw of a monster. I hid him under my cloak, clutching his feverish body to me. We crawled past sentries, past machine gun towers, guided only by flashes of lightning. She dragged him here, to the beacon of silence. Her father was still alive at the time, but already descending into madness and senile dementia. Martha hid Arthur in the basement, in a secret cavern beneath the foundation, where the tide entered. There, amid the dampness and stench of sea salts, she nursed him for weeks. She gave him her ration of bread, fed him bitter herbal infusions, and changed the bandages on his wounded soul. One night, Martha paused, her face lit by a strange, almost gentle light that instantly vanished under a new wave of shadows. When the fever finally subsided, he opened his eyes. He was as weak as a newborn kitten, but his gaze was different. Steely. He took my hand, his fingers hot and dry, and looked straight into my soul. In that moment, Arthur understood everything. He realized this woman had risked more than just her job or her freedom. She had put her life on the line for him, a beggar, a ragged man the world had written off. Before he left, when the fog was so thick it obscured his fingertips, he stood on the threshold of the lighthouse, Martha said. He was still swaying with weakness, but his voice was as firm as the granite of these cliffs. He didn't thank me. Great debts aren't settled with thank you. He said something that would become my curse and my salvation for 40 years to come. Martha sat up straighter in her chair, and for a moment her figure lost its senile frailty. He said, "Martha, you gave me air when my lungs were burning. From this day forward, you are the only clean spot in this rotten city. Remember, as long as I breathe, not a shadow will touch your threshold. All the fog of this sea, all the thieves of this harbor, all the knives in the alleys will become your shield. You will be untouchable as long as Arthur lives." Gromov felt the room grow colder. Now everything fell into place. The image of Scar standing in the icy water, repairing the boat, was no longer a surreal image. It was a ritual, an annual reaffirmation of the vow made in the fog many years ago. Arthur kept his word. He rose from the bottom, carving his way to the top of the criminal underworld, leaving that very scar on his face as a reminder of the price of survival. But having become a monster to everyone else, he remained a loyal dog to one woman. It was his people who made the lives of anyone who dared to look askance at the lighthouse a nightmare. It was he who was behind the mystical disappearances of Marta's enemies. He created the legend of my holiness to protect me from the truth I hold, Marta said with a bitter smile. He thought fear was the best defense, and he was right. But he didn't understand one thing. By protecting me from people, he couldn't protect me from the ghosts of those listed in the Book of Visitors. Martha looked at her hands, nodded, trembling, covered in pigmented spots like splashes of dirt. Mercy, Victor, is not a free gift. It's a bargain. I saved his life, and in return I received eternal solitude on this lighthouse, surrounded by an army of killers who consider me a deity. I am locked in my safety. Gromov rose slowly. His cloak hung heavily from his shoulders, as if saturated with this story. He looked at Martha, a small, broken woman who had once accomplished the impossible. In this world, where everyone sought to betray to survive, her deed shone like a lighthouse lamp on the darkest night. But the price of this light was prohibitively high. Now do you understand why he was standing in the water? Martha whispered after the departing inspector. He wasn't repairing the boat. He was trying to wash off the blood of those he had to kill to fulfill his promise to me. But the sea doesn't wash away such blood. It only dilutes it with fog. Victor stepped out onto the lighthouse balcony. The wind blew in his face, bringing the scent of salt and old pain. Below, at the foot of the cliffs, the sea foamed, and Gromov seemed to see faces in the white crests of the waves, hundreds of those who had never seen mercy. He understood, in Misty Harbor, there were no pure heroes or villains. There were only people bound by invisible threads of duty, guilt, and silence. And the strongest of these threads ran from Arthur Scar's blooded hands to Martha's worn heart. The evening after the conversation at the lighthouse proved particularly difficult for Gromov. Returning to the city, he didn't go home. Instead, he wandered the abandoned docks for a long time, watching the rusty skeletons of cranes pierce the fog like the limbs of enormous insects frozen in their death throes. His thoughts, usually clear and dry, now resembled a tangled coil of barbed wire. The solution to the mysticism surrounding old Martha came to him not as a sudden revelation, but as a series of painful clicks, merging into a single, frighteningly logical picture. This wasn't magic. It was the mechanics of devotion, elevated to the absolute. Gromov recalled the faces of those very same piranhas, the bandits who had turned grey overnight. In light of his new knowledge of Scar and his oath, this scene was redrawn in his imagination in the style of a brutal noir. Imagine 5 armed robbers making their way to a lighthouse. They're sure they're going to rob a defenseless old woman, but they don't know that every inch of that cliff is visible through the sights of rifle scopes. Shadows lurk in the shadows behind every boulder, behind every outcropping. Scar's men are silent professionals for whom the boss's orders were more sacred than the Bible. They weren't just guarding her, Gromov whispered to himself, looking out at the dark water. They were creating a spectacle, a theater of horror. He imagined the piranhas being surrounded, without a single shot, without a single scream. Dozens of guns pressed to the backs of their heads in pitch darkness. And then the worst part began. The men weren't killed. They were forced to watch. Perhaps they were injected with the very same drugs Martha had once stolen, causing hallucinations and paralyzing fear. They were locked in the lighthouse basement and forced to listen to Martha's voice reading their own sins from the Book of Visitors. For people whose fathers and grandfathers had betrayed each other, the truth was more terrible than a bullet. It burned their brains from the inside, turning them into empty shells. In this distorted world of Misty Haven, brutal killers whose blood never dried on their hands were transformed into surreal guardian angels. It was a grotesque paradox. Those who disdained the law and human life knelt before an act of mercy committed many years ago in a quarantine barracks. Gromov saw this metamorphosis clearly. Scar, Arthur, didn't simply give orders. He instilled in his men that Martha was their only chance for redemption. As long as she lived, as long as her lighthouse stood, a tiny island of purity existed in this damned city. Killing was commonplace for them, but protecting something sacred was a new, almost religious feeling. One glass of water in hell, Viktor mused, and now a whole army of demons is building a wall around their savior. He remembered the patrols at the port. Now he understood why certain areas around the lighthouse were always the quietest. There were no police there, only shadows. Sailors spoke of strange lights on the rocks and how the fog sometimes took the shape of human figures. Now Gromov knew, these weren't ghosts. These were Scar sentries, cloaked in grey cloaks that blended with the mist. They invisibly accompanied Martha when she went out for groceries. They brought firewood to her doorstep. They repaired her roof under cover of night while she slept. All the mysticism was man-made. Curses came true because they were carried out by the coast's finest killers. Those who tried to harm the saint faced not the wrath of heaven, but Arthur's icy calculation. Boats smashed against the rocks because someone deliberately extinguished the navigation lights or cut the steering cables. People disappeared because their bodies became crab food in places where the current never washed anything ashore. Gromov felt sick. This devotion was simultaneously beautiful and ugly. It was built on mountains of corpses, but its root was mercy. She created a monster, he thought of Martha, and this monster now guards her peace with a tenderness no human is capable of. The inspector approached the edge of the pier. Below, in the murky water, an old newspaper floated. The headline screamed reform and a new era, but here in Misty Haven, time stood frozen in eternal twilight. Gromov realized that solving the mystery brought him no relief. On the contrary, it imposed an even greater responsibility on him. If he uncovered this mechanics, if he destroyed the legend of Martha's mystical power, he would also destroy her protection. Without the aura of sanctity, she would become just an old woman with a dangerous book in her hands. And then she would be killed, quickly and prosaically. Arthur Scar understood this better than anyone. He knew that in Misty Haven, only fear of the supernatural could stop those who did not fear human judgment. So he cultivated this fear, fertilizing it with the blood of his enemies and shrouding it in a fog of lies. So this is your shield, Martha, Gromov said aloud. A legion of the damned, guarding the silence. He looked at his hands. In this world of bold lines and exaggerated shadows, he himself was beginning to feel like a character whose contours were being outlined ever more boldly. His choice was simple: become part of this system of silence or try to break it, condemning everyone to chaos. Viktor Gromov turned and walked away from the docks. He was no longer just an inspector. He had become an accomplice to a great hoax. He understood the main thing. In the hell that was Misty Haven, angels wore scars and hid knives in their sleeves, and their wings were made of thick, impenetrable fog. And all this, for the sake of a single act of kindness, which happened so long ago that it had almost become myth. The solution was prosaic and terrible. There was no justice, only duty. And this debt now reached out to him, Gromov, connecting him with an invisible rope to the lighthouse, the old woman, and the murderer who stood in the icy water, atoning for his sins with slave labor. The air in the lighthouse cabin became so thick it felt like he could cut it with a knife. Viktor Gromov felt the huge, shapeless shadow of the city shifting behind him, Misty Harbor, which lived by the laws of blood and duty. Marta sat in her chair, and the lamplight snatched her hands from the darkness, resting on the visitor's book as if they were a detonator button. Do you think, Viktor, that Arthur is the most terrible thing in the city? Her voice became a barely audible whisper, sending thick, vibrating shadows crawling across the walls.
No.
The monsters that growl in the gateways are understandable. Scary are the monsters who smile from election posters. She slowly flipped through the yellowed pages. In this visual style, every movement of the old woman was accompanied by the exaggerated sound of dry paper tearing. She stopped at an entry dated May 1958. Look at that name, Inspector. Maxim Valevsky. Today he's our illustrious mayor. The man who cuts ribbons at the openings of new hospitals and talks about the revival of the port. But in this book, he's listed as number 412. Marta pulled the book closer to the light. Gromov saw a detailed, almost cartoonish description. Prisoner 412. Distinguishing marks, birthmark on left forearm. Tendency to hysteria. And below, a long list of names. 12 people. His friends. His comrades in the student circle that dared to dream of freedom. He betrayed them all. Marta closed her eyes, her face a frozen plaster mask. My father personally heard his denunciations. Valevsky didn't just talk, he made them up. He invented details to make his testimony seem more compelling. He peered through the peephole as they were led down the corridor to the iron maw, chewing on the rations he'd been given as a reward for his betrayal. Gromov felt cold sweat draw deep furrows across his forehead. Mayor Valevsky was a symbol of stability. If this truth came out, the city wouldn't just shudder, it would explode. 12 families whose fathers and brothers rotted in the fortress because of this man still live in the haven. Many of them now hold weapons, money, and influence. Do you understand what this means? Viktor asked hoarsely. One call from you, one page sent to the newspaper, and Valevsky will be torn to pieces right on the steps of City Hall. Yes, Marta nodded, her one eye flashing with a vengeful fire that immediately faded, replaced by bottomless sadness. He will be torn to pieces. And then his supporters will begin to take revenge on the families of the dead. A wave of lynchings will engulf the city. Old grudges will flare up like dry gunpowder. Shadows from the iron maw will take to the streets and begin to devour the living. Misty Harbor will become one big mass grave. She pressed her palm to the book cover. In this world of bold lines, her fingers felt like steel bars, holding a monster within a cage. I'm not keeping silent for his sake, she croaked. I despise him with every drop of my old blood. I remain silent for those who sleep soundly tonight, unaware that their well-being is built on a rotten foundation. Revealing the truth isn't always justice, Viktor. Sometimes it's just another murder, only on a city-wide scale. Gromov looked at her and saw more than just an old woman. He saw Atlas, supporting a sky full of toxic fog on his hunched shoulders. She had borne this burden for decades, knowing the true value of every respectable person in this port. My father was a jailer, Martha continued, her figure slowly fading into the shadows of the room, becoming part of the lighthouse's interior. He believed that order was based on fear, but I realized something different. Order is based on merciful silence. Some things must go to the grave with us. She rose slowly. The movement held a final, solemn heaviness. She walked over to the fireplace, where the embers smoldered, smelling of salted wood. It's time to close this case, Inspector. I feel my fog lifting. Soon I myself will become an entry in this book. She reached out for the list of Judases. I leave that choice to you. You can take it and become the new keeper of the keys. or you can help me end this forever." Gromov looked at the book. He saw power in it. He saw the opportunity to cleanse the city of its taint. But then he remembered Scar repairing the boat. He remembered the silence that had fallen over the port thanks to this woman. He understood that truth without mercy was just another form of execution. "Burn it," he said quietly. Martha smiled, for the first time in a long time, and it wasn't a frightening smile. It was human. She tossed the massive tome into the fire. The flames flared unnaturally, green and blue, greedily devouring the names of traitors and heroes. The paper blackened, curled, and Gromov seemed to hear 1,000 sighs of relief escaping from the chimney into the night sky. "You made the right choice, son," Martha whispered. "Now you are the last witness. Your memory is the only place where these sins still exist. Don't let them escape."
Final.
Years later, Viktor Gromov, now quite an old man and leaning on a cane, stood at Martha's grave in the cemetery behind the Rock of Sighs. The headstone was simple, without an epitaph, just a name and dates. Beside him stood a tall man in an expensive coat, his face crossed by a deep, old scar. Arthur's scar no longer carried knives in plain sight, but his gaze still made the fog freeze. They stood in silence. There were no guards, no witnesses, only the sound of the surf and the distant cries of seagulls. "She was the only one who saw me as a man," Arthur said quietly, "and I was the only one who saw her as God." "She was above both," Gromov replied. Viktor remembered that night at the lighthouse and the burned book. Mayor Valevsky had long since retired and died quietly in his bed, revered by all as an honorary citizen. The city hadn't burned. Families lived in peace. A bloody war had never begun. Gromov looked at his hands. There was no blood on them, but he felt the weight of those secrets that now lived only in his head. He understood Martha's main lesson. Mercy is the most difficult form of justice. It demands the destruction of documents, the distortion of history, and the eternal lie for the sake of saving living souls. "Time to go," Arthur said, adjusting his collar. "The fog is thickening." "Yes," Gromov nodded. "It always thickens here." They parted ways, dissolving into the white mist. Gromov walked slowly, feeling his own outlines growing increasingly blurred. He was the last keeper of the secret that changed his life, and he would carry it until his death, as he had promised. Some stories have no ending. They become legend, myth, a lesson for those willing to listen to the silence. And in this silence of Misty Haven, Martha's voice still resounds, reminding, people are more important than truth. Life is more important than history. Mercy is more important than justice. Viktor Gromov smiled at the fog and disappeared into it forever, leaving behind a city that never knew to whom it owed its peace. 30 years had passed, but Misty Harbor had barely changed, only grown more overgrown with rust, salt, and legend. Viktor Gromov stood on the edge of the cliff, where the concrete of the pier gave way to jagged, storm-battered granite. In this world, drawn with thick ink and harsh shadows, his figure seemed even more angular than before. Time had bent his back, turning the once stately inspector into the likeness of the gnarled staff he now leaned on. Before him loomed the beacon of silence. Abandoned, its lantern glass shattered, it resembled a blinded giant still keeping its endless vigil. The white paint had peeled off, revealing dark stone like dried blood. The fog, a constant companion of this place, licked the base of the cliffs as usual, obscuring the outlines of the coastal rocks. Gromov slowly lit a small fire in the shadow of the old boathouse, the very same one Scar had once repaired. The flame was weak and flickering, but in the gathering twilight, it seemed the only living spot in the entire harbor. Viktor reached into the inside pocket of his worn coat and pulled out a sheaf of yellowed sheets. These were his personal notes, written decades ago. They contained names, dates, fragments of transcripts from the visitor's book, which he had foolishly or habitually saved on that fateful night. All these years, these papers had burned in his chest. They were his curse, his black mark. "It's time," he croaked. His voice, cracked and weak, was instantly drowned out by the roar of the surf. He looked at the first piece of paper. It bore the name of a man who now held a high position in the ministry. This man, once a frightened youth in the dungeons of the Iron Maw, had pointed a finger at his brother to avoid a thorough interrogation. The brother had died, and the traitor had built a brilliant career on the bones of his family. Gromov held the paper to the fire. The edge of the paper blackened, charred, and a moment later the flames greedily devoured the name. In this graphic world, The smoke from the fire did not dissipate. It rose in heavy black rings, intertwining with the fog to form a bizarre pattern. One by one, the secrets of the haven were consigned to oblivion. Here are the notes about the scar, about how many people actually lay in the ground to ensure Martha's sanctity. Gromov understood. If these notes fell into the hands of modern-day lawmen, Arthur, living out his days in the shadows, would face life imprisonment or a bullet in the back of the head from the grown children of his victims. But Martha hadn't saved Arthur so that Gromov could destroy him. Truth is poison, Viktor whispered, watching the ashes settle on his shoes. He remembered Martha's face at their last meeting. Her single eye, which saw right through the rottenness of human nature, and her quiet laughter. She knew that truth doesn't set you free. In Misty Harbor, truth only fueled hatred. It was like an infection passed from father to son, turning the lives of entire generations into an endless act of revenge. By burning these documents, Gromov realized he was committing a crime of official misconduct. As an inspector, as a man of the law, he was obliged to hand over the evidence to the archives. But as someone who had experienced the weight of merciful silence, he understood. These papers were the fuse for a bomb that would blow the city to pieces. Revealing the truth now would mean ruining the lives of hundreds of people who, over the past 30 years, had learned to live anew. The children of traitors are not guilty of their father's sins. The grandchildren of executioners should not answer for the blood on their grandfather's hands. Marta had given this city a chance for redemption through oblivion, and Gromov decided to reaffirm that right. As the last scrap of paper crumbled to dust, Viktor felt a strange lightness. His shoulders seemed to straighten. He looked at the lighthouse. The fog around him grew thicker, almost tangible. For a moment, Gromov thought he saw silhouettes in this white haze. There, at the very edge of the water, stood a tall man with broad shoulders and a white scar across his face. He didn't move, simply staring at the fire. And a little higher up, on the lighthouse balcony, the grey shadow of a hunched woman flickered. They weren't ghosts in the usual sense. They were part of the city, part of his, Viktor's, consciousness. They were witnesses to his choice. "Now I'm the last," Gromov said, addressing the void. "The last one who remembers the smell of the iron moor. The last one who knows why the mayor cries at night." He understood the main lesson of his life. Justice is when the guilty are punished, but mercy is when the innocent are protected from the consequences of another's evil. In a world where everything is drawn in bold black lines, sometimes you need to deliberately blur the contours to give people room to breathe. Gromov stood up, leaning on his cane. The fire had burned out, leaving behind only a handful of grey ash, which the wind immediately picked up and carried toward the sea. Now everything was clean. No documents, no records, no archives. Only his memory, which would fade with him. He turned and slowly wandered away from the lighthouse, toward the city, where the occasional lights were already flaring. He walked along the rutted road, and each step was heavy but confident. Viktor Gromov didn't regret a single burned page. He knew that tomorrow the city would wake up just as grey and grim. People would rush to the port, sailors would curse in taverns, and politicians would lie from the podium. But there will be no new war in this city. There will be no lynchings or bloody showdowns over old lists. He became the guardian not for power, but for peace. And this was his personal, final act of mercy. "Sleep peacefully, Martha," he whispered without turning around. "Your silence is in safe hands." Gromov vanished into the fog, becoming as much a legend of Misty Harbor as those he had once investigated. He carried a secret to the grave, and in that silence lay the highest truth he had been able to comprehend in all his long years. Justice was satisfied that evil was left in the past, and life went on, sheltered by the saving white shroud of sea fog. This story has come to an end, but its echo still resounds in the mists of Misty Harbor. Do you think Gromov made the right choice by choosing silence over the truth? Is a world built on lies worth saving? Leave a comment below with your thoughts on this choice and Martha's secret. Your opinion is very important to me. And if this dark walk through Misty Harbor made your heart beat a little faster, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Here, shadows always reveal their deepest secrets.